Well, last week, well, we moved on. We got a little bit into these theses that Spong is talking about. We looked at the incarnation. We looked at the three-tiered understanding of God as the creator, that what Spong is referring to as the theistic God. A God who is removed from creation, who breaks in periodically, to kind of set things right. And part of that has to do with miraculous works that this God is able to do. We're probably today going to move into that chapter, but last time we got to the point where we were talking about the virgin birth, and Spong, he writes each of his theses in very short order. And what I realize as I'm reading this book is that what Spong has done is he's taken about 10 or 12 of the books that he's written in the past, and he's put them in this nice little compendium. He wrote a book on miracles. He wrote a book on the virgin birth. And it's just a nice summary review of his thought on this. But you probably are not surprised to learn that he doesn't think the virgin birth is much of anything to hang our religious hats on. The virgin birth, understood as literal biology, is totally unbelievable, he says. Far from being a bulwark in the defense of the divinity of Christ, the virgin birth actually destroys that divinity. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before we do, I want to remind us also something that I know we've talked about it before, but I want to assume we all know this hypothesis as to how the Gospels were written. But remember, they weren't all written by people following Jesus around. We followed the historical critical method, and we're not getting historical, or first of all, we're not getting contemporaneous accounts of Jesus' life. The Gospels are all written well after Jesus has left the planet, well after his crucifixion. The earliest person writing about Jesus, and doesn't tell us much of his life, was Paul. But then when we start to get to the narrative of Jesus' life, scholars, for the most part, have agreed upon this so-called four-source hypothesis. And we've talked about this before, but I want to just give you like this brief introduction again, because we're going to talk about Matthew and Luke and their understanding of the virgin birth and why they wrote what they wrote. The idea goes like this. If we were going to look at the Gospels historically, the first full Gospel that was written appears to be Mark. There are a lot of reasons for us to think about that, to make that statement. Mark is the shortest. Typically when people write, they will add to Gospels. Mark seems to be the narrative outline for the Gospels that come later. Matthew and Luke, where they differ in their schedule of events, what's the right word I'm looking for, their order of events, they always come back to Mark. Mark is always the place that seems to be the standard. So for that reason, it looks as if that Mark was written around 70 of the Common Era interestingly, to a Gentile audience. Now, it originally was written to a Jewish audience, but there are a lot of suggestions that that the audience it was intended for in its final form, or the form we have, was Gentile. Why was that? Well, for example, Mark explains a lot of Aramaic words that he wouldn't have to explain to a Jewish audience, Jewish followers of Jesus. But there's this other document that is hypothesized, that's out there. And as you know from the past, Spong doesn't believe that this document ever existed, but a lot of people in the Jesus Seminar use it as a way to understand how Matthew and Luke came to be written. It is simply called Q, German Quelle, which means source. And it's simply a list of sayings. Jesus said this, and there's no narrative connection between Jesus' sayings, but you get, for example, the Beatitudes. Blessed are the the poor, blessed are the poor in spirit, or blessed are the meek. You have the Beatitudes, for example, in both Matthew and Luke, but they're not in Mark. So that suggests that when Matthew and Luke were writing their Gospels, they had Mark in front of them, but they also had a common source that is being referred to as Q. Now, on top of that, it's believed that Q, it's hypothesized that Q was written probably around 55 of the Common Era. Mark around 70. Matthew, with Mark and Q in his hands, wrote probably around 85. And then Luke shortly after Matthew was written, also using Mark and Q. But Matthew and Luke were writing to particular audiences. Matthew's community that he was writing for, referred to here as M, had specific material that doesn't appear in any of the other Gospels. And this community appeared to be a Jewish community that, that probably grew out of the synagogue, grew out of the Jewish followers of Jesus. And this gospel was written at a time when Jewish followers of Jesus were starting to distinguish themselves, differentiate themselves from the Jews. And so there was a need on Matthew's part to establish Jesus's Jewish identity, but also his uniqueness from Judaism. And so we get a lot of that in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, Luke, on the other hand, which is written in a more classical style of Greek, appears to have been written to a Gentile audience. And that audience had material that was unique to Luke that is in none of the other Gospels. Why am I saying this? Because the birth stories of Jesus both belong to this unique material that cannot be found in other Gospels. Matthew's birth story appears only in Matthew and appears to have been written for the needs of that M community that was Matthew was writing to. Luke's material, Luke's birth narrative, which is very long, I mean, good 5 chapters long, which includes not just the narrative about Jesus' birth, but the prequel to Jesus' birth, and that's the birth of John the Baptist, and the angel appearing to Elizabeth, and actually it was Zechariah and Elizabeth, but then Elizabeth talking to Mary, and then you have the Song of Mary, and you have the Song of Zechariah, and then finally you have the story about Jesus being born. The two stories just do not match up. Therefore, we cannot eat. The Matthew birth story has really very little in common with the Luke birth story. So what Spong wants to establish right from the start, which he will establish throughout this book, is that this is not history. We're not looking at history. In fact, there are so many elements in these stories that that are so similar to what we know has the kind of stories that have happened in the ancient Near East prior to this. For example, the virgin birth story or the miraculous birth story is something that can be attributed to Caesar Augustus, something that can be attributed to Alexander the Great. The virgin birth story, for example, can be attributed to the mother of the Buddha. So these are features of myths. These are part of the archetypal aspects of the hero stories that we find in so many of the world's religions. Go ahead, Will. Will's got a question, but he's not unmuting. There you
go. So I'm familiar with the Gilgamesh story, and in it there is a magic weed.
Yep.
Now, is that in the Bible? Is that in the Old Testament or New Testament anywhere?
What do you think the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is, and the tree of everlasting life? The tree of life that the angels guard in the garden, and Gilgamesh is able to rescue that plant from the bottom of the ocean, right? What happens to it, Will? Do you remember?
No.
It's stolen by a serpent.
Oh, yeah.
So here
Okay.
you have these archetypal images, the serpent, which represents knowledge, and not just concrete knowledge, but kind of a mystical knowledge, right? And we find these tales, and what we're going to find is in the birth stories, a lot of these mythic elements are coming, to the surface all the time. And I mentioned last time, but the one person who really introduced these ideas and brought them to the popular culture was Joseph Campbell, the Power of Myth, a series of videos. But he's building on Carl Jung's psychology. So, any other questions about
Thank
this?
you, Dan.
Dan,
Yeah, go ahead.
uh, remind us if I recall this right, that all four books of the Bible were written in Asia Minor, not in Bethlehem, not in Galilee. Wouldn't this, if that's true, wouldn't this have affected who their audience was probably going to be?
I'm going to have to. I know that one. I think Matthew may have been written in Antioch, and so that's still. I mean, it's Syria, right? But they weren't written in, for the most part, Jerusalem or Bethlehem or any of those places. And why was that? Because by the time they're getting written, several things have happened. The temple has been destroyed in Jerusalem, which has caused a dispersion of Christians and Jews out of Jerusalem. And then B, Christians, though they weren't being called that just yet, the followers of Jesus who were Jewish are in conflict with the Jewish synagogues, and they're differentiating themselves. They're trying to distinguish themselves from the Jewish synagogues. And one of the places they can do that quite well is in Asia Minor, as you're suggesting. So, but yeah, geographically, these things are not being written in the context in which they take place. Interesting point. I talked about this last time. I'll go over it very briefly, but when we look at the stories about Jesus that as recorded in the Gospels, and when we look at what we profess about Jesus, we're talking really about a tale of two cultures. The Jewish culture is really subsumed into this larger Greco-Roman culture, which has been influenced by Greek philosophy. And by the time many of the doctrines of Christianity are written, Plato and Neoplatonism have found their way into the culture, and thus we have a very dualistic understanding of God and the world, right? And somehow Jesus brings those two things together. And it's not really clear that the Jews would have thought of things that way. We have Augustine to think about that. So what we have to do first is, realize that we often will read the Bible through the lens of our doctrine, and the historical critical method tries not to do that. So when I'm reading the Bible, I can't assume, oh yeah, this Jesus who's talking was fully God and fully human. Historically, as it's being written, it's not clear that people were thinking that way, right? So we have to think about it in its context. So we have to deconstruct. And so we look at things historically. Where is the first place that Jesus is really mentioned? Is Jesus' birth? Paul, writing in Galatians, only says he's born of a woman, which is an interesting, statement to make. 48 of the Common Era. By the time you get to Mark and 70 of the Common Era, you have Jesus who's referred to as the son of Mary, which is really interesting, right? And we've seen this before. The story about Jesus' mother and his brothers are called to come and get him because he's saying crazy things. He's beside himself, as they say. But there's no mention of a father here, right? Which suggests, according to Spong, that this was a kind of underhanded slight that we don't recognize because we read the Bible through our doctrine, right? We know the story about Joseph and Mary. Well, there is no Joseph in Mark, right? There is only Jesus who is the son of a mother, which is to suggest that maybe Jesus was base born, that early on, people who were detractors from the Christian message, from the message of Jesus as Messiah, were saying, bringing up these kinds of things. Well, he was born, and there is this tale, born of a Roman soldier and a Jewish prostitute, things like that. So this could be evidence that they're trying to counter some of that vitriol, or whatever you want to call it, bad news about Jesus, right? So we can't really rely too much on Mark. When we get to Matthew, that's the place where we really get a story about Jesus' birth. And remember, and this is what Spong wants to emphasize more than anything, just as we have to deconstruct doctrine about Jesus, we also have to deconstruct our experience. And the experience we need to deconstruct is the Christmas pageant that we all sit through in some form or another every year of our life, where we got angels and shepherds and kings all showing up at a manger outside in a stable. Very few of that whole scene is not present in any book of the Bible. It's all amalgamated into one scene. But when we separate those two things, we can see what the authors are trying to get across. Remember, Matthew, writing in 85 of the Common Era, Matthew was writing to a Jewish Christian audience, followers of Jesus that were once Jewish. And this becomes very clear. And Constance and I were talking about this. And at some point, Constance, I will ask you to ask your question, because that's what we're going to focus on today, your question. The Jewish audience becomes clear right from the very beginning of Matthew's gospel. Matthew, I should probably check myself because I find myself confusing this. Just let me read the first chapter here. I won't read the whole genealogy because it can be tedious, but it's basically a summary of first and second Kings. Why does Matthew start with a genealogy? That's the question we need to ask, right? There's obviously some sort of rhetorical reason why a genealogy is important for Matthew here. Is it because of this charge of the base-born Jesus, who has no legitimacy in the Jewish faith? Matthew says, well, no, he's the Messiah. And because of that, I want to show to you just how he is connected, not just to the people of Israel, but to the king himself, out of whose line the Messiah is to come. If you're a good Jew, that's what you believe. So he starts with this genealogy. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob, on and on and on, all the way down to Joseph, who is established very clearly as having descended from the line of David, going all the way back to Abraham himself, the father of the faith. But it's in this tradition of Matthew that Matthew feels like he has to introduce a father, right? Because you can't have, as in Mark, you can't have Jesus being referred to as the son of Mary. I won't say, I'll try to keep it clean here, but we have our own derogatory statement referring to a son of, right? You son of Mary, or you son of an illegitimate woman, right? It's very derogatory. So Matthew has to introduce a father. And he also has to introduce this idea that Jesus is not just a Jewish man, a legitimate Jewish man, but he has this intimate connection with God as well. So the Annunciation that we know so well, this Annunciation of the angel Gabriel, who appears to Mary and says, "You are with child," and Mary sings this wonderful, response called the Magnificat. That's nowhere found in Matthew. This is a very patriarchal way of looking at things. The angel appears to Joseph. Mary is incidental in all of this, by the way, just as you would expect from an ancient Near Eastern patriarchal culture. Joseph, being a righteous man, is told that the child in Mary's womb is the child of the Holy Spirit, was conceived by the Holy Spirit. So now we have the introduction of the divine origin of Jesus, and thus the introduction of what's eventually going to become the virgin birth. But it's really interesting what this says in here, because this is not how we understand, the virgin birth, at least in our 21st century understanding, which has been highly influenced by the Roman Catholic tradition. Listen to what it says here. When Joseph awoke from his sleep, the angel appeared to him in his sleep. He did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son, and he named him Jesus. Now, what does that suggest to you? He didn't have any relations with her until after the son was born. Isn't that pretty much what it sounds like? No. She was always a virgin, right? That's what we're going to hear later, but that's not what this says. It's a story that appears to have a very Jewish background, especially when you think about the emphasis on the prophecy that is fulfilled. All of this is done according to Matthew. She will bear a son, says the angel. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. By the way, the name Jesus, Yeshua, is the Aramaic form of the Hebrew name Yahshua, which is Joshua. He is our redemption. So that's basically what the name Jesus means. All this took place, this whole interaction between Joseph and the angel. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, or God with us. Problems. Well, but first of all, let me stop right there. Any questions or comments?
Dan?
Yeah.
Flipping back to your matrix on the sources,
Yeah.
I always wondered, Paul is not in that matrix.
No.
Did the writers of the Gospels have any access to the letters of Paul?
It's pretty clear that John was influenced by Paul, but there's no narrative structure. There's no, syntax or sentence that seems to have come out of Paul's letters. I'm not an expert on this, but it's pretty clear that Paul's texts, the letters of his, that he wrote to the churches, did not make any kind of very clear, very clear presence in the Gospels themselves. We can't look at a sentence and say, oh, this is right out of Paul's letters. But by the time you get to the Gospel of John, you can see that some of the things that Paul has been talking about, this mystical understanding of Jesus, seems to have influenced the Gospel of John. So
I was just thinking
Dan?
about, excuse me, the book of Acts. Does that not, segue back into Paul?
It follows. Yeah, this is tough. It depends on what you're saying, because Luke was a companion of Paul, or appears to have been a companion of Paul during Paul's second missionary journey, when they're called over into Macedonia, and they're established the church at Thessalonica and Philippi and Corinth. and there it's pretty clear that Luke, by he writes a first person narrative in parts of Acts that say, hey, I was there, right? So there is that kind of influence that Luke knew Paul, or at least that's what the tradition says, that Luke knew Paul, and then was influenced by Paul. But I can't think of a place. Of course, it's a different genre of letter. It's not a letter. It's more of a history than it was a letter. So I can't think of a place where Paul's actual words appear in Acts. Though again, this is not my area of expertise. But you're right. Paul is developing his own thing, really, in many ways. But if there's going to be an influence theologically, it's going to come in Luke and John.
Dan?
Yeah, go ahead.
The genealogy tree that you're talking about, am I right that it was primarily through the male line?
Correct.
And I don't quite understand how Jesus would have been a descendant of David and everybody when he didn't have a father.
Yeah. Well, George, that's Constance's question. Okay. And so Matthew is writing and he has a whoops moment, like, oops. if I'm going to say one thing about Jesus' divine origin, then it's going to, I don't realize it, but it's going to unwittingly negate the very thing that I was trying to establish in the first place. So it's either one, either Jesus has a divine origin and Joseph is not his father, or Joseph is his father and thus Jesus does not have a divine origin. Okay. So that's the question. And guess who's going to come to the rescue for us on that? Luke. It's really funny. And I'll show you how in a minute here. But just think of some of the features that we find in Matthew's gospel are very important if you're Jewish. But Matthew even fudges things a bit, right? Look at how he writes this prophecy. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel. Now, I don't know how quickly I can find Isaiah here, but I'm going to try to find exactly. I think that's Isaiah 10. Should have done this beforehand. I always do this. Sorry, guys. Let's see what it actually says. The story, the sign of Emmanuel. Again, the Lord spoke, Ahaz, and ask a sign of the Lord. And Ahaz, of course, the king, doesn't want to ask a sign. And then Isaiah said, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary mortals that you weary my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. What does Matthew say? Look, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. Isaiah says nothing about conceiving, right? Isaiah is pointing to a young woman who he's using as a metaphor for God's presence in the life of the king, Ahaz. Look, the young woman is with child. It has nothing to do about her conceiving or anything. It also says it's not a virgin, right? She's not a virgin. She's just a young woman. Now, in Hebrew, the word that you find in Isaiah in the prophecy is Alma, A-L-M-A-H. I think I have it here. Alma versus Parthenos. When the Hebrew Bible gets translated into Greek, the word takes on this meaning of a young girl who is not married or had sexual relations, right? The prophecy in Isaiah refers to a young woman who is already with child, right? not by any divine origin, right? It's people think that this child may be Hezekiah the king that would eventually be born to King Ahaz. But the translation into Greek becomes, I'm sorry, moving ahead too far. The translation into Greek becomes the foundation. The mistranslation becomes the foundation of this whole virgin birth idea, right? The prophecy itself had nothing to do with the sexual purity of the woman. So got some problems right from the start there. Matthew wants to ensure his Jewish audience that he's building the argument for Jesus' messiahship on the prophecy, and that Jesus is a fulfillment of a prophecy. But in order to do that, he has to shave the narrative to his purposes, right? So what are some of the other narrative features in this? Well, you want to emphasize to your audience that Jesus the Messiah is like King David. So what better way to do it than to have Jesus visited by the kings of the world? They follow his star. By the way, another feature of mythology, there was a culture hero by the name of Mithras in the Persian religion, who would be known as bringer of light to the world by the fact that he was born under a star. Mithras precedes Jesus by 500 years. The kings bring Jesus these gifts. They travel from afar. And of course, there's a story about Herod wanting to make sure that this Jesus isn't going to be a problem. And oh my gosh, that is a feature of so many mythic stories. The bringer of light who is going to have to overcome the obstacles of his opposition. Think about Moses and Pharaoh, right? There's a historian by the name of Suetonius that tells a story of Caesar Augustus, who is understood by the present Caesar. When Caesar Augustus is born, Octavian is born, the powers that be know that he's being born, and they try to kill him, but they make this escape. Well, guess what happens with Jesus? Herod tries to kill him, and of course an angel appears to Joseph and tells them to take them into Egypt, and all of this to fulfill the prophecy, lo, I have drawn my son out of Egypt, right? Matthew's doing a lot of things here. He's establishing Jesus as a king and as the Messiah in the Davidic line, who is foretold throughout Scripture and is of divine origin. Note what isn't there, though. The star is there, the wise men are there, the gold, frankincense, and myrrh are there. Jesus is born in a house, according to the Matthew narrative, and it appears to be in Jerusalem. I think I have that right. But that's where the wise men find him, in a house, right? What is not there are shepherds, angels, singing glory to God in the highest, and the story of Mary being visited by the angel. That's not in this story at all. Why? Because it's this community, I can't find my cursor over here, they're the ones who need to be uplifted by the features of this narrative. Now, when we go to Luke, it's a different story altogether. And, I've already told you about the angel that appears to Zechariah, and he doesn't believe that his son is going to be, a great man, and he's muted. And Elizabeth understands full well that John the Baptist is going to be the harbinger of the great Messiah. She's the cousin of Mary. An angel appears to Mary, as represented here in Leonardo da Vinci's Annunciation, and it says, fear not, I bring you great tidings. You are going to be the mother of the Messiah. How can this be? I'm I am a virgin, says Mary. And the angel says, that's the way it is, that you're going to be the mother of the Messiah. And then Mary goes into this song that's called the Magnificat. My soul magnifies the Lord. He has looked kindly upon his servant. And it's a song that very clearly is based upon the song of Miriam that is sung by Moses's sister upon their liberation from Egypt. So pretty clearly, Luke is trying to draw upon some established mythology in having Mary sing a song quite similar to her namesake, Miriam, in Exodus. Remember, Luke is written around 90 of the Common Era, and he's writing to primarily Gentile Christians. And remember, Luke's theology is going to be very based upon Paul. Now, this is why your question, Denny, is so complex, right? Luke definitely is influenced by Paul in terms of his theology, but you don't see any direct references to Paul's letters, word for word references to Paul's letters. But remember, Paul is all about inclusion of the Gentiles within the fold of the Jewish community, in the chosen community, right? The community of salvation and redemption. And so it's interesting what he does with this genealogy. So let me go to Luke. And Luke introduces his gospel. He doesn't introduce the genealogy until about chapter 5. But let me just get to this place here. Luke introduces his gospel with really the foretelling of the birth of John the Baptist, and then the foretelling of the birth of Jesus. And then finally, to legitimize him completely, he offers this genealogy, which very interestingly, let me find it here. The ancestors of Jesus. Now remember what Matthew did. He started with Abraham, right? And worked his way all the way up to Joseph. Luke is going to start in a different way. He's going to start from the present and work his way back. Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his work. He was the son, and note this, he was the son as was thought, he says in parentheses. Not clear if that was in the original text or not. He was the son of Joseph, son of Heli. Well, wait a minute now. Who was the son of Mathat, who was the son of Levi, son of Melchi, son of Janus. If you start matching this up with that genealogy that Matthew has, it's wrong right from the start. Joseph isn't the son of Heli. Let me see if I can find it again real quick. I won't just take my word for it. Let me see. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, is Matthew, right? So, but when we go to Luke, Joseph is the son of Heli. And you follow those names all the way back, and they go all the way back, not just to Abraham, but to Adam, interestingly enough. Now, just as a little aside there, the reason Luke wants to do that is he wants to include the whole of the human race, right? That descends from Adam, instead of the whole of the Jewish people, which descends only from Abraham. Abraham is where Matthew started, right? If you go down the line, none of these names match up. So how do we come to terms with that? Well, the scholars will tell us that what we're doing here is we're following the line from Jesus through Mary's line. According to Jewish custom, when you marry into a family, your father-in-law basically becomes your father. So Heli, who is, as described here in Luke, who is the father of Joseph, is actually Mary's biological father. So according to this genealogy, it's going through Mary herself all the way back to Adam. Now, why do you suppose that is? Because, George, somebody figured out exactly the question you asked. Oh my gosh. He's either the son of David through Joseph the man, or he's the son of God, but he can't be both, right? But now Luke is going to solve the problem. Luke is going to solve the problem by saying Mary herself was also a descendant of David. And it doesn't matter that if Joseph is in the picture at all, because it's Mary's genealogy that through which Jesus is going to come. So we've eliminated Joseph in this, right? But we've also created another problem. Let me move on to this. We did talk about Matthew's genealogy before and the women who were present there. And maybe I should just say this very, very quickly, but you might remember that what Matthew does is includes these women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, all of whom have rather sketchy backgrounds, right? But Jesus is descendant of all of them. Tamar, who is with whom Judah has incestuous relationships and gives birth to a son named Perez, who is in Joseph's genealogy. Rahab, the prostitute, Rahab, I guess I should say, the prostitute at Jericho. Ruth, who, according to Spong, seduces Boaz in the book of Ruth. And Bathsheba, of course, who gives birth to a son through a relationship that was adulterous, fairly. So it wasn't the adultery. Her son actually died when she had adultery with David, but David later married her after he killed her husband. And, all of this nasty stuff in the background. So why is this important? Well, this is what Spong has to say about it. And then I want to get back to Luke in the time that we have left. Is this not an unusual way to defend one's founder against the charge of illegitimacy? Putting all of these women in the genealogy, especially when, people are saying that Jesus is an illegitimate child himself. Was Matthew saying, just as a convicted felon executed in a public place, just as an executed felon could be the life in which God is best seen in human history, so too could a child called illegitimate be the life in whom God was met in a new way. In the virgin birth story, Matthew claims a holy origin for Jesus, but then he seems to add that God can raise up a holy life even through incest, prostitution, seduction, and adultery. I submit that this is a powerful witness. Really interesting take on that. Matthew wants to have his cake and eat it too. There is a divine origin in Jesus, but at the same time, Jesus, because of God's power, can be raised up out of all of these rather questionable ancestors preceding him. I'm sorry, let me move on here too. Now let's go back to Luke. Luke solves one problem, but then he creates another, right? He solves the problem that you asked, George. How can Jesus be considered a legitimate son of David if Joseph has no say in the matter? If his genes, so to speak anachronistically, if Jesus doesn't descend through Joseph, then how can he be a son of David? Well, you attribute or you ascribe Davidic lineage to Mary, so that the biological line of Mary goes back to David and thus into Jesus himself. But then that creates another problem, doesn't it? Because now we have to explain the whole idea of just who Jesus is. Is he fully God? Is he fully human? What kind of a character is he altogether? And this is what gives rise to the virgin birth. Augustine would have this issue as well. People are going to have this issue if human beings, if sin comes through all human beings, you know, in Augustine said in the act of, in the sexual act itself, then if Jesus is human and he is born of a human woman, then wouldn't he at least have inherited his sin from Mary? Well, possibly. We can't see any way around it unless you also ascribe to Mary an immaculate conception, right? And this is what the Catholic Church did. Well, Mary was also immaculately conceived. She was not born of a man and woman, but of a woman and the Holy Spirit. This is what the Roman Catholic Church believes and set to doctrine in the 19th century, the so-called Immaculate Conception of Mary. But this just creates the problem all the way back. Mary's mother was named Elizabeth, so that was she immaculately conceived altogether? Now we have to start answering all these questions about what does it mean for Mary to be the mother of Jesus? What does it mean for her to be a virgin? As you know, Matthew has created that problem on the basis of a very poor interpretation of prophecy in Isaiah. It's not a virgin shall conceive, but look, a young woman is with child. So from here, we get the beginning of so much doctrine that has filtered its way into the Christian religion that relies upon the miraculous in order to understand it. And this is the problem, Spong says, that we can no longer believe in the miraculous. The miraculous is part of that theistic worldview of the past where God breaks into nature and upsets the laws of nature in a way that just doesn't seem conceivable to us right now. So for all this reason, we have to get rid of the idea of the virgin birth. You might note, and you might remember this as we talk about what we believe when we recite the Apostles' Creed. Born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead and buried. He descended into hell. All of this stuff, just though we recite it, Spong is saying we live like we don't believe it. This virgin birth story is a feature of a lot of the folklore and mythic stories of the ancient Near East and even of the Far East, if you will. There were other virgin births in antiquity. The one that is most similar to that of Jesus is the birth of the Buddha. Siddhartha Gautama, his mother, whose name eludes me for the moment, has a vision. And she goes to sleep and she's married to her husband, who is a king. And before they have any kind of relations, she goes to sleep and dreams of an elephant with a lotus flower who touches her belly. And she wakes up and she knows that she's with child. And she goes to her husband and says, I don't want to have any kind of sexual relations. You know, I am with child and it's going to be a great child. They are on a trip. Interestingly enough, it is while she is on a trip that the queen goes into labor. You know, just like Mary on her trip down to Bethlehem and Jerusalem, the queen, the mother of the Buddha, is on a trip as well. She's going to have the child at her family's home, and on the way, she goes into labor. And she goes off into the side of the road, and there the Buddha pops out of her side. He was not born the way regular people did, not between blood and mucus, as they often say in existential circles, right? The way we were all were, but a very clean birth. And he stands up and he says, I've overcome the world. I am no longer, this is my last existence. I will never be reborn into the world again. I am the Buddha, something along those lines. I'm the greatest, right? And then, they bring him home, and then there are all these people who come, the wise come to him, and eventually he grows to be a very wise man himself. But that's another very famous virgin birth story. It's almost as if our leaders have to come from some sort of supernatural realm. Something about their quality suggests something that is otherworldly. So we have to attribute to them an otherworldly origin. Alexander the Great, very similar story. His mother, Olympia, and his father, Philip, both had a premonition. Olympia goes to sleep one night and has a dream about, the fact that, I can't remember what the object is, but it's very similar to, the queen in the Buddhist story, something touching her belly, and she wakes up. And Philip has a very similar dream, and thus Alexander the Great is born. And he was considered to be, because of his great acts, a demigod, the offspring of a god and a human being. Caesar Augustus, the same way. I think Socrates or Plato, don't hold me to that. But we have a lot of these stories in our folklore. And it's good to recognize them for what they are. They are archetypal images that provide meaning to us, right? We're reading the hero's journey in many ways, as Joseph Campbell liked to describe it. But we're not reading history. We're reading something that's much more meaningful than history. So anyway, we've got a few minutes left. Are there any comments? I'm sorry, I just run on and talk, and I hope I haven't, kept you from asking questions. But are there any questions or comments about this?
And I'd have a comment or two.
Yeah, okay, Mac.
I was rereading today a book that was written in 1994 by my religion professor that many of you know, and that was Dr. Scott McCormick.
Right.
And he has a chapter in his book, which is Behold the Man, and he has a chapter on the virgin birth. It's interesting, I hadn't looked at this book for a while, but on the back there's a blurb that says that McCormick holds out a Christian faith that was not dependent on a popular conscious on a postmodern consciousness. It is a dramatically refreshing volume, and that blurb is written by one John Shelby Spong. So, but he points out
removed.
He points out that an argument can be made, and he reports it. He may not, this may not be just him, but you can argue that in the Gospel of Luke, he does not explicitly say that there's a virgin birth. There's all of the Magnificat, and it's fine. But if you look at chapter 2, Joseph goes for the census with the woman he's engaged to who is with child. Well, it happens now, and it probably happened then, and that is a possible interpretation. Luke is not that explicit. And if the only reason that we have the tradition is because of the mistranslation from Isaiah 7,
right,
that's the slender reed it hangs on. And that's corroborated by the fact that there is no evidence whatsoever that doctrine was recognized or important by the earliest Christians,
right,
as evidenced by the fact Mark appears completely ignorant of it. John, who's later, he's not interested in it.
right.
And it's done for art. It's done to make a theological point. In Matthew's case, and we started getting into that, but his basic point is Jesus is the new Moses. We have the whole story about the bulrushes practically, and we have the slaughter of the innocents, which we know did not historically occur.
Right.
But it's there to make the point, which the Jewish readers of Matthew at that time would have clearly understood.
Correct.
This is the new Moses. This is Emmanuel. And they were familiar with Isaiah 7. They were familiar with the Moses story. That's his point. And to take it really any other way it just doesn't make any sense. And there's a lot of internal criticisms that I'm not sure we'll have time to get into as to why it's just absurd. But the whole idea that, all of this Christmas stuff was then everybody was immediately inflicted with a mass case of amnesia because they couldn't remember who this guy was, even his own mother. It's just, it's there, it was written, it's art, it's theology, but I think it hangs on a pretty slender reed, unfortunately, because it was made part of the creeds. You know, the Christian church lived with it for hundreds of years. And in fact, it's only been in the last 150 maybe where it's been credibly questioned.
Right. And
The-
because of the emphasis, I think that the Catholic Church put on the Immaculate Conception of Mary, taking it yet another step further, right? Do you know the story of the turtles all the way down about, the woman who comes to, oh gosh, Bertrand Russell and says, you can talk all you want about how the world's created, but I know the turtle is sitting on, or the earth is rests on the back of the turtle. And Russell says, well, what's the turtle on? She goes, don't try to fool me. It's turtles all the way down. And so, the Immaculate Conception, it's Mary all the way down, as Mary's mother was immaculately conceived. And before that, and all the way down, right? But I think the real problem was Augustine, who was absolutely petrified by the debauchery that he lived in his life as a Manichaean. And then he becomes a Christian, and that becomes utterly evil to him. So any kind of connection with sexuality and the birth of Jesus through the sexual act was anathema for him. And I think his theology just lent that kind of dualism to, of course, that was after the Nicene Creed, but the Nicene Creed went through many revisions. But his theology lent itself to a kind of dualism where we shouldn't trust, anything of this world, and sex is bad. And, therefore a man of God should never have been born through sexual union. Well, yeah, we don't know how it can happen any other way, right? Anybody else want to jump in?
Dan?
Yeah, Danny.
Yeah, myths of origin go clear back to the emergence of Homo sapien. As you had to be able to explain as a sentient human being,
Right. Yeah.
the ultimate origin, and so that is passed on for hundreds, 65,000, 65 million years. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a long time.
Interesting. Right. Got to explain it somehow. Came from elsewhere, but still is very much with us, right? I mean, this idea of our own godlike qualities, which we all perceive. We can imagine ourselves as living forever, for example, right? We have the ability to imagine that, and there's something that's self-transcending in that. And so, how do we explain that? This self-consciousness, this sentience. Well, I'll answer that question next time. Right. We can ponder that forever, right? But the next time, let's talk about miracles, which, again, is connected very much with this, but also think in terms, the Spong is going to make the case that Mac was just making, that Jesus is going to be portrayed in the light of his predecessors, specifically Moses, Joshua, that duo, and Elijah and Elisha. If you read a lot of the miracles that Jesus is said to have performed, and then you read about Elisha in First Kings, almost one-to-one correspondence. So you see the mythic, what's the right word I'm looking for? The mythic representation of Jesus as falling in the line of these great men. Moses, the bringer of the law, Elijah, the father of the prophets. So, well, thank you all, everybody. We're past our time, but I love the conversation very much. And I will see you next time.